So let's summarize our spinal reflexes by talking about a reflex arc. Now, a reflex arc is just the basic functional unit of these reflexes, and it's going to involve 5 different components that all interact to cause that reflex. So we're going to start with a sensory receptor in our skin. So a sensory receptor in the skin is going to pick up some kind of stimulus. Maybe you stepped on a nail, or you're exposed to really hot temperatures or really cold temperatures. Whatever that stimulus is going to be perceived and picked up by this sensory receptor. The sensory receptor is a sensory nerve. So it's going to move that nerve impulse from the body to our spinal cord. So body to brain, right? It's sensory. The spinal cord is then going to pick up and interpret, make a decision on that information, and then send it back through a motor nerve to the muscles to move your body. So let's just go over one simple scenario here. Let's imagine that you step on a nail. So you step on a nail, sensory receptors, pain receptors are going to pick that up, send it via a sensory neuron from the body to the brain or spinal cord here. The spinal cord is then going to have interneurons that are going to interpret that data and determine that we need a reflex. So it's going to decide what to do and then send a motor signal through a motor neuron back to the muscles involved. And then the muscles involved are going to be that effector organ. And then those muscles are going to contract to lift your foot away from that nail and get you out of that harmful situation. So this reflex arc is just our basic type of reflex that the spinal reflexes are going to engage in. So all of those that we talked about are going to have a reflex arc. They all involve these 5 components. Now, moving on, we're going to move on to not the spinal cord itself, but we're going to talk about these branches of spinal nerves that are coming off of the spinal cord. So in order to do that, let's first kind of just do a brief review of what these spinal nerves are. So the spinal nerves, remember there's 31 pairs of them, and they all come off of the spinal cord. Some end up branching off in many places. We'll talk about those later. They're called a plexus. And then some for example, in our thoracic region, are just single nerves that come off. So these match pretty much our spinal column, the vertebral column, with the exception of the cervical. So we have 7 cervical vertebrae. We have 8 cervical nerves. We have 12 cervical vertebrae. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae. We have 12 thoracic nerves. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae. We have 5 lumbar nerves. We have 5 fused sacral vertebrae. We have 5 pairs of nerves coming off the sacral branches. And then our coccygeal, the coccyx, we have 1 nerve coming off of them. So if you add all these up, we have 31 pairs of spinal nerves. Now let's look at the anatomy of a spinal nerve. And that's what's going to be Handout 13F. So it says spinal nerve axons are grouped within our connective tissue layers. So we're going to have different layers that make up the different neurons that are wrapped together to make up a nerve. Now, the really cool thing about this is it is very similar to something that you have already seen. So I'm going to move to the handout. Let's look at Handout 13F. And when you look at Handout 13F, before we get into these different wrappings, let's just look at the picture. So if you look at the picture, this should look very similar to something that we talked about before in chapter 10. Now, if you look at this, this looks just like a muscle, doesn't it? All right, that's because nerves and muscles are made almost the same way. So if you look at this, we have this entire picture represents our entire nerve. The entire nerve is going to be built out of these bundles of neurons that are called fascicles. And then, see, we've pulled out a fascicle here, and each individual fascicle is made out of many nerve cells that we call neurons. Well, the neurons are made out of axons. So if we go from smallest to largest here, we have a bunch of axons bundled together to make a fascicle. These fascicles are then all bundled together to make our entire nerve. This is just like our muscles. Remember, our muscles were made out of muscle fibers that were all bundled together into fascicles. The fascicles were then all bundled together to make the nerve itself, or to make the muscle itself. Now we have a nerve. So each individual component, every axon is wrapped in connective tissue called endoneurium. Remember, every muscle fiber was wrapped also in connective tissue, and we called that endomysium. But in the nerve, the axons are wrapped in endoneurium. Then all those axons are bundled together into a fascicle. The fascicles are then all bundled together in perineurium. And then the fascicles all grouped together are bundled to make the entire nerve. And then the entire nerve is wrapped in epineurium. So we have the same prefixes to a different word for these connective tissues that wrap around the nervous tissue, just like the muscle tissue. So up above here, I just have that endoneurium is going to wrap each individual nerve fiber or nerve cell, or we could call it an axon. The perineurium is going to wrap around every fascicle, which are the bundles of nerve fibers. And then the epineurium is going to wrap around the entire nerve. Now, what's really cool about this is that epineurium that's wrapping around the entire spinal nerve, when the spinal nerve meets the spinal cord, that epineurium blends in to the dura mater. So actually, when we think of the spinal cord branching, the spinal cord's dura mater, that outer membrane of the meninges, is going to blend in and become the spinal nerve's epineurium. And this is how our spinal nerves branch off, and this is how they kind of continue from the spinal cord itself. So when we really think about the nervous system, what's really kind of crazy is that the nervous system is really all one big thing. So your brain and your spinal cord are all connected, but then the spinal nerves that are branching off of that spinal cord, they're really just a continuation, a branching of all of the spinal cord tissue. And so this is how our spinal nerves are constructed. Now, what we're going to do next is we're going to examine these spinal nerves a little bit more, and we'll use a couple of other handouts to do that. So that'll be in the next couple videos.